Thank you, Orna, for that wonderful meditative piece. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light, one if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm for the country folk to be up and to arm. Then he said good night, and with muffled oar silently rowed to the Charleston shore, just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset, British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend, through alley and street, wanders and watches with eager ears, till in silence around him he hears the muster of men at a barrack door, the sound of alarms, the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down their boats on the shore. Then he climbed the tower of the old North Church by the wooden stairs with stealthy tread to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch of the somber rafters that round him made masses of moving shapes and shade. By the trembling ladder, steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment to the roofs of the town and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath, in the churchyard, lay the dead, in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like a sentinel's tread, the watchful night wind as it went creeping along from tent to tent, and seeming to whisper, all is well. A moment only he feels the spell of the place and of the hour, the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead. For suddenly, all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now gazed on the landscape far and near, then impetuous stamped the earth, and turned and tightened his saddle girth, but mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer, and then a gleam of light. He springs to his saddle, then bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till, full on his sight, a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hoofs in the village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles in passing a spark, struck out by a steed, flying fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet through the gloom and the light, the fate of the nation was riding that night. And the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil, broad, and deep, is the mystic meeting the ocean tides. And under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is heard the tramp of the steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of river fog that rises after the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting house windows, blank and bare, gazed at him with a spectral stare, as if they already stood aghast of the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over meadows brown. And one was safe and asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be the first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. You know the rest in the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again under trees and at the turn of the road, and pausing only to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through every night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice of darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all of history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeat of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. History is a tenuous thing. When Unitarian Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in 1860 wrote this poem about fellow Unitarian Paul Revere, it is likely he knew that he was stretching the truth. For Paul Revere had written his own account of this ride, and he did ride to Lexington to join to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams that the regular British army was approaching. He then set off for Concord, but was captured before he got there. Now, he bluffed and told the British that he had indeed warned the whole countryside, and that bought some time for other messengers to get through. And Unitarian Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a poem about what happened the following day. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps, and time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone, that memory may their deed redeem, when like our sires, our sons are gone. Spirit that made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them and thee. A poem written at the time of setting up a monument at Lexington and Concord. Was the shot heard round the world? Probably not. News traveled slowly in those days. Only historians and poets made the decision that this was when the Revolutionary War officially began. People could argue for an earlier date, perhaps the Boston Massacre or the Boston Tea Party. It would be still a year and a half before the Declaration of Independence, and perhaps that should be considered the official start of the war. But poetry won the day. The shot heard round the world. What is remembered has more meaning than what actually happened. Longfellow never states in his famous poem what Paul Revere yelled on his famous ride, but some of us all know that it was, "The British are coming, the British are coming." I think that might have come from a Disney movie. Of course, they did not yell this because it would have made no sense to the people of the countryside because everybody considered themselves British. The redcoat troops were called the regulars, and the regulars are coming, the regulars are coming, just does not have the historic ring to it. This week, this Thursday, I'm going on a pilgrimage to Boston. I will be attending our General Assembly. I'll be visiting the headquarters of the Unitarian Universalist Association. I will be looking for what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. I will be looking for what it means to be an American. All Muslims are required to make, at some point in their lifetime, a pilgrimage to Mecca. And I believe that it is a good idea for all Americans and all Unitarian Universalists to make a pilgrimage to Boston. Boston is the home of the Revolutionary War. It is also the home of Unitarian Universalism, and the two are intertwined. The Freedom Trail in Boston contains 16 sites of revolutionary history. 4 of them are also UU sites. One of the sites is King's Chapel, originally an Anglican church, but shortly after the war, it didn't change its name to Episcopal like other Anglican churches. They rewrote the Book of Prayer, striking out the references to the Trinity, and became one of the first Unitarian churches in America. And its graveyard is part of the historic trail, where it contains the governor of the Massachusetts colony. And it remains somewhat of an anomaly in our denomination. For 2 centuries later, 2.5 centuries later, they still are using the Book of Prayer. Now, I know some of our own members are really just very liberal Episcopalians. It would be worth your while to make a pilgrimage to King's Chapel. Next is the statue of Ben Franklin. He attended Unitarian churches in England and Boston and Philadelphia. He never officially joined. He was so committed to his own religious freedom that he would never actually join a denomination. But his wisdom and independent spirit has been a great influence on our denomination and our nation. Next is the site of the old corner bookstore where people would gather. And it's the same now whenever I go to Borders or Crocs and Botanicals. What's the Barnes and Nobles. Yeah, I always find UUs every single time. And this is where the people hung out. And this is the bookstore that later would publish Thoreau's Walden. And it represents the need for a free press in our society. In the early 19th century, Harriet Beecher Stowe said, "All the literary men of Massachusetts were Unitarian. All the trustees and of professors of Harvard College were Unitarian. And all the elite of wealth and fashion crowded Unitarian churches. The judges on the bench were Unitarians." UUs love to read and read freely. This is the part of our heritage that I embrace. As an American, it makes me very nervous that our government wants to be able to subpoena the records of every book I buy and every book I take out of the library. Because books mean freedom. Across the street from the Old Globe bookstore was the Second Universalist Society, led by a Universalist, Jose Ballou, who wrote a book called The Treatise on Atonement, declaring our freedom from hell, a notion too radical even for the Unitarians of his day. Make a pilgrimage, a religious pilgrimage, to the nearest bookstore or library. Get a radical book today. It is your patriotic duty. And the fourth UU site on the Freedom Trail is the home of Paul Revere, a war hero, even though his deeds were exaggerated by Longfellow. We need to ask, what was the revolution about? Was it about freedom, liberty, and human rights? Or was it just a way of avoiding paying tribute to a king, avoiding the paying of taxes? We need to ask what our religion is about. Is it about freedom, liberty, and human rights? Or is it just a way to avoid praying in tribute to anything? The revolutionaries became legislators and eventually came to fund the government with taxes. And we ultra-Protestants eventually will need to stop protesting and find a way to articulate and live what we actually believe. In the first century of this nation, Boston was the heart of America, and Unitarianism was the blood that flowed from its heart to the brain. Since that time, we've become marginalized. Boston is derided as the home of the liberal elites that are out of touch with real Americans. Freedom, liberty, human rights are derided as special interests. But these are the ideals that make this country and this religion worth fighting for. If we do not, we will be free to read whatever the government allows. We will be at liberty to attend the state-supported churches, and we will have the right to remain silent as we are locked away. I'm going to Boston, the UU Mecca, in search of something more difficult to find than weapons of mass destruction. I want to find the UU and the American spirit that has the courage to ride out in the night and shout out a warning. I may be captured before I reach Concord. I may never be remembered, but perhaps like those embattled farmers, I may have the courage to stand. So when I fall, there will be others to carry on the fight. May you join me. I take your hearts and your minds, and even some of you along on this pilgrimage. And I hope we continue in this journey together. May we bless and be blessed.